2020. It was a great year for music despite the circumstances of the world. It gave musicians time to divert their attention from touring and life as we knew it, and truly focus on the evolution of their craft. Evolution we are now seeing the effect of as numerous artists have released incredibly improved and refined projects in 2021. However, amidst the storm that was 2020, there was one album that really stuck with me, an album that perfectly reflects the environment we found ourselves in, an album that shows what can truly happen when you lock one of the most creative minds in a house for 3 months, an album that has quickly grown to be one of my all-time favorites, Folklore by Taylor Swift. Folklore, the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through generations by word of mouth. In other words, a story told through generations, a timeless tale, and that's exactly what Taylor Swift created on her 8th studio album. On the surface, Folklore is Taylor's transition into the indie folk realm, decorated with an abundance of different stringed instruments and soft pianos under a blanket of ethereal fantasy. For 64 minutes, you get a glimpse into this vintage, dreamy state of mind Taylor found herself in. But if you stop and pay close attention to this record, the layers of the album begin to reveal themselves. And that's when a glimpse turns into an experience, and you truly find yourself wound up and entangled in Taylor Swift's Folklore. Because underneath the sparkling mandolins and rustic upright bass lines, Folklore tells a story as mystical and enthralling as the title would suggest. Beginning with the holy trinity of Folklore, the 3 main songs that illustrate the storyline the album is built around, the now famous love triangle between the songs Cardigan, August, and Betty, with each song being sung from the perspective of a different character tied to this love triangle, those characters being Betty, James, and Una. I'm going to begin with August because though it comes second in the official track list, in the context of the story, not only does August chronologically come first, but it's about the very event that causes the ripple effect across the whole album, an innocent teenage summer fling. August is sung from Una's perspective. Now, it's worth mentioning the narrator's name is never truly revealed, but fans have begun dubbing her Una, which stands for the unidentified narrator of August. August is the only time Una ever appears on the record, but it's her chance to tell her side of the story, her angle on this love triangle. The song is Una looking back on her short-lived romance with the character James, a romance that would have been completely harmless, except James already had a girlfriend, Betty. The 2 characters fall in love despite James knowing it was wrong and Una knowing it wouldn't be able to work out, but as Una says, it was enough for the young lovers to simply live for the hope of it all, showing the youthful immaturity that becomes a constant theme across the record. But ultimately, as the summer came to an end, so did their love, as Una comes to the bittersweet realization that James was never hers to lose, and how August simply slipped away into a moment in time, because it was never hers. August being a blanket term not only for the month, but to describe their relationship as a whole, which transitions into the fan favorite of the record, and arguably my favorite, Betty. Betty is sung from James's perspective, and is the only song of the 3 written in the present tense. The song is James trying to win Betty back after she found out about Una through a gossip named Inez. The song starts in a school gym at a dance where James sees Betty dance with someone else, so he storms out in frustration, but as he's walking down a cobblestone sidewalk, Una from August pulls up in her car and tells him to get in, which begins their secret affair we learned about in August. Fast forward a bit and James's summer fling with Una has ended, but Betty switches her homeroom after finding out about Una through Inez. Realizing the deep mistake he made, James spends the rest of the song rehearsing and planning how he's going to attempt to win Betty back. But it all depends on if Betty is willing to forgive him. The song builds throughout until the climax at the end, with the key change as James finally gets the nerve to walk all the way up to Betty's doorstep. But that's where the song ends, on a cliffhanger. With the rising sonic tension and key changes paired with the sing-along chorus, it gives a satisfying end musically, but narratively we're left to our imagination, until we arrive at the final song of this triangle, Cardigan, which is alluded to in the outro of Betty, clearly confirming there is a link between the 2. Cardigan, like August, is a song written in the future tense looking back. It's Betty's turn to let us inside her world and see what was going on in her head through this whole ordeal. It's Betty reminiscing on her complex relationship she had as a teenager. Taylor herself actually mentioned she was inspired by the idea of a cardigan holding onto its scent of loss after decades. This idea of revisiting something that still holds its history tightly. Unfortunately for James, Cardigan confirms Betty did not end up taking him back, explaining how she predicted James would come running back to her after the thrill of his summer fling came to an end, and also explaining how Betty knew James thought she wouldn't find out, because when you're young, they assume you know nothing. Calling back to the lyrics on the song Betty, but as Betty the character says in the bridge of Cardigan, I knew everything. And that's the love triangle featured in Folklore. But the deeper you read into certain lyrics, the more connections you can make, slowly revealing how the entire album can be broken into 3 overlapping plot lines. The first plot line revolves around the affair itself. August is the beginning of the affair. Mirrorball provides more details as to what actually happened between James and Una. Betty is the return to school after the summer fling with James trying to win Betty back. Cardigan is Betty's reaction to the affair. Illicit affairs could be Una recounting her love with James from her point of view. Exile featuring Bon Iver is Betty and James arguing with each other as Betty officially ends the relationship. And then finally, The One is Betty convincing herself she's finally over James and motivating herself to move on. The second plotline is the overall character arc of James. This Is Me Trying is James after Exile desperately trying to make things right with Betty, but he realizes the only thing that will bring either of them peace is if he leaves town, which is what he does in the song Peace. He moves away and ultimately joins the army. At this time, it's worth noting this all takes place during the early 1930s, meaning when James joins the military, he ultimately gets sent off to fight in World War II. But tragically, James dies in battle as alluded to in the track Epiphany. My Tears Ricochet is James's funeral. And lastly, Hoax is Betty being unable to cope with the death of James as she begins to go crazy, which transitions into the final plotline, the aftermath. The track Mad Woman sees Betty leave town and buy a house in Rhode Island. In the song 7, Taylor herself is born into this world and begins living her childhood in Pennsylvania, where she actually grew up. Invisible String is Taylor now grown up singing about her current relationship with Joe Alwyn, but the song could also be read as Taylor drawing an invisible string between her and Betty, because finally, the last great American dynasty sees Taylor purchase the Rhode Island home from Betty who had passed away. But the greatest part of the whole concept might be that Betty was a real person. Enter Rebecca Harkness, born in 1915, died in 1982. After remarrying to the heir of Standard Oil, Rebecca became one of the richest women in America at the time, but with her money came several short-lived marriages and an overall chaotic lifestyle we hear about in the last great American dynasty. In 2013, Taylor buys the Rhode Island home previously owned by Harkness, just as we're told in several tracks, and the sparkling ribbon to tie it all together. Her whole life, Rebecca Harkness went by the nickname Betty. Folklore is Taylor telling the story of Rebecca Harkness. In conclusion, while Taylor was locked in her home, she made an entire folklore about it, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality by creating a narrative history that tells the story of the very house she had been confined to.